You are listening to the 31st broadcast of TBR Radio's, the TBR History Hour, with your host, TBR contributing editor, Dr. Edward DeVries. On today's show, Dr. Ed talks with retired Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Kennedy, who for decades was a professor of military history at the Army Staff College in Leavenworth, Kansas. The primary subject of today's conversation is the Battle for Berlin and the end of World War II. Also discussed are the horrible war crimes committed by the Soviets and how the other Allied nations essentially facilitated them or at least looked the other way.
Let's go ahead and talk about the Battle of Berlin. In all, you gave me the list of the 12 battles.
Yeah.
And, the 12, I said give me the top 12 battles or military campaigns. And the Battle of Berlin made the top 12. Why did the Battle of Berlin make the top 12?
Talk us into taking it. It was a political decision. They wanted to get the capital of Berlin.
So, had we not let the Soviets take Berlin, do you believe that the city and ultimately the country would have still been divided in half, or do you think that there would have been one Germany coming out of the end of the war?
Oh, yeah, it would have been divided in half because Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin got together at Yalta and split the pie before the end of the war. They knew who was going to take what, where the zones would be. So that was already a done decision. We were way inside what would become the Soviet zone. We got to the Elbe River and captured a lot of that stuff. We had to turn around and give right back to the Soviets because the agreement at Yalta said that they would get these lines, they drew the lines according to the districts that Germany was their states, how they were divided up. And our army was on the Elbe River. I mean, they could have been to Berlin in about 3 or 4 more days, and they held there and let the Soviets take it. The downside is, we gave them taking Berlin the honor of taking it. The upside is we didn't have thousands of more American casualties because it was going to go to the Soviets anyway.
So, okay, the liberation of Italy. Patton was in a race with Montgomery. Damned if the British were going to beat him to that glory. Let me do something here. Let me hang up and let me call you back because we've kind of been breaking up for the last few minutes and I want to see if I can't get a better connection.
Open your web browser and type in www.barnesreview.org and discover the Barnes Review magazine. In the Barnes Review, you will read vignettes of man, from the prehistoric to the very recent, from forgotten races and civilizations to first-person accounts of World War II and the late Cold War. There is no more interesting magazine published today, nor a more significant and important subject than real history. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review. You can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review magazine in its print form, or in convenient electronic delivery. Our host has been a subscriber to both formats for years. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review.
So then what you're telling me is that Patton was a lot better at following orders than his reputation would have led us to believe.
No, I wouldn't say that. I'd say he was pretty cognizant that he had already messed up a couple of times before, and he didn't want to add to his problems.
Okay.
I think he knew how far to push the envelope, and he was at the outer edge. Remember the raid on Hammelburg that he had in March was, a month and a half before the end of the war, was a total disaster. And the war, because the war was ending, the press really didn't pick up on it.
So the Soviets committed, some atrocities against the Germans. Call them war crimes is what they should properly be called, I guess.
Oh, yeah, massive.
Do you believe that one of the reasons why Eisenhower decided to allow the Soviets to go in there first was there a desire to see that kind of brutalization and, let the Soviets commit the war crimes so that the Americans and the British don't have to?
No, I don't think so at all. I think the reason Eisenhower lost interest in driving to the east is because everything was settled at Yalta, and he knew that Germany was going to be formed under the Soviet sphere of influence, and there was no need to waste American soldiers to capture something that would be given back to the Soviets. He was very cognizant of, suffering more casualties. And I don't think it was for political reasons. I think that was his view, that there's no need to waste American lives if it doesn't do anything for the American cause. Right.
Well, as I understand it, the Germans were pretty well dug in, and that there were a lot of, there was a lot of guerrilla warfare, if you will, resistance to the Soviets as they came into Berlin, that the German people were very much still fighting, whether that was actually an organized underground movement, or if that was just the German people who, had the resolve and the stubbornness to, to defend their homes until they could no longer do so.
Well, I think there were a couple of factors. This was a very political war. The people had been mobilized, of course, since 1933. They'd had, Hitler Youth, and these young people had been brought up in that system. The real problem is they knew that the Soviets had been grossly mistreated by the Germans, and they knew that there had been massive war crimes against the Russian people. They knew that the Soviets they knew, because the Soviets told them they were going to do it, they were going to be treated very, very harshly, and so they knew what was coming. And that, what do? Throw your hands up and say, I'm not going to do anything, I'm going to let them come in here and commit atrocities? Or do you pick up a rifle and try to take as many of them with you as you can? And a lot of them, the Germans, the Volkssturm, which was the civilian militia, went out to do their duty to defend their homeland. Even though they weren't responsible for the war crimes, the Soviets had said, we're going to take it out on you. We're going to rape your women and kill your people. So they really didn't have a choice. The Nazis put them in a very precarious predicament. And of course, what happened was many of them were killed.
Right. So then the other Allied countries, obviously they saw what the Russians were doing. Did they attempt any intervention, be it militarily or even politically, or did they just turn a complete blind eye to what the Soviets were doing?
They pretty much turned a blind eye, and we knew what was happening. In fact, there was a lot of angst in U.S. military units that had to turn Germans back over to the Soviets as prisoners, because the Germans knew what was going to happen, so a lot of them fled to the Americans to surrender, but under the terms of the agreement with the Soviets, we had to turn them back over. They went to Soviet gulags, and many of them died. They were killed outright by the Soviets or killed in the prison camps. Of the 95,000 estimated Germans taken at Stalingrad, only 5,000 came home to Germany.
Wow.
So they were pretty vicious. And they saw it as payback. We're going to pay you back for what you did to us.
But could it be argued that the Soviet payback was far greater than the original German sin? I mean, did the Russians get a bigger slice of flesh than they had originally lost?
In the long run, I would say probably yes. The number of war crimes committed by the Soviets is astounding, and they're conveniently overlooked because they were our allies. So when they had the Nuremberg trials, a lot of this stuff was not allowed to be brought out because they were our allies. Of course, 2 years later, it would have been fine because they weren't so much our allies. They were, the Iron Curtain had been lowered, and it would have been fine. But at the Nuremberg trials, they were literally protected from prosecution of war crimes, which they committed. For example, the Katyn Forest massacre of the Polish army officers was pushed as and this is brought up in Diana West's book as well, and she does a good job on this. The Soviets took all those Polish officers they captured in 1939 when they invaded Poland. They took them to the forest at Katyn and massacred them. And then they claimed when the Germans invaded Russia, they raised the sign up and said, oh, look what the terrible Nazis did. Well, the Nazis had a big investigation. They had Allied officers come in and look at the graves and watch the proceeding as they came in and disinterred the corpses. And the Allied officers saw that the bullets used were from Soviet weapons, not German weapons. And they wrote, yeah, this is obviously a Soviet thing, but the Americans bought into the lie until 1991. The Soviets threw their hands up and said, yeah, we murdered them. When the Soviet Union fell, they finally said, yeah, we did it. But the Americans, because of the communist influence in the U.S., claimed for years the Nazis did it. They wouldn't see the truth, even though it was plain as day.
So, was the Battle of Berlin in the top 12 because of its military significance, be it strategy, execution, or so forth, or was it just because of the overwhelming number of war crimes that were committed?
Yes and yes, and mainly because I lived there, so I'm really interested in Berlin.
So, of course, you grew up in post-World War II Germany.
Yes.
And so, what was the real perception? And you may have been shielded of this for in some perspective because you were a child. You may have been shielded from it in some perspective because you probably lived in base housing and so forth on a U.S. military installation. But, given the fact that, not only was their nation basically conquered, but, you have both the Soviets who were on the eastern side and you have the Americans who set up their bases on the western side. In other words, their conquerors never left their country. It wasn't like, we won the war and then, went home. We're still there. So
right.
What was the real opinion of Germans of Americans when you were growing up in Germany?
They loved Americans.
Okay.
They loved the older people especially. The younger ones, not so much. And I was in high school there, so, I talked to a lot of the Germans, and then when I went, I was stationed back in Germany a couple of times. I talked to the old guys and gals. They loved Americans. You know why? Because we were not the Soviets. And they said we were so lucky the Americans got this part of the country because otherwise the Soviets would have. They despised the Soviets. They hated the communists. So they said, 1948, when the Marshall Plan, restored Germany, and the Soviets did nothing but suck all the life out of East Germany, taking all the factories and, stealing everything they had. The West Germans knew very well how good they had it with the Americans there. They loved having the Americans.
So then the Soviets were that bad that
they were terrible, and the number of rapes of German women in Berlin measures in the thousands, tens of thousands. I mean, they were bad people. I mean, this was the Mongol horde incarnate. They were very bad, and they were brutal. But, like I said, they saw that as payback for what the Germans had done to them. Mm-hmm. I think it was even worse than what the Germans had done to them, but it was bad. They hated the Soviets. Even the East Germans did not care for the Soviets. Communist East Germans, were not that close to them. I have a cousin whose family lived in East Germany. His mother is German, and he went when the wall fell. He went to visit his German relatives, and they were so glad the Russians were gone, the Soviets were gone, because they had communism crammed down their throats. It was like the Nazis. The Nazis were replaced by the communists.
Right. Well, as I understand it, that throughout Eastern Europe, that there were, however many, thousands upon thousands of Eastern Europeans who, as the war was coming through Eastern Europe, were just basically throwing themselves into the German army because they saw it that at the end of that war they were either going to be Nazis or they were going to be communists. They were either going to be under Germany or they were going to be under Russia, and they did not want to be communists and they did not want to be under the Soviet Union.
Well, they did up until the very end, and then all of a sudden you started seeing defections. You saw units going over to the Soviet side, which, it boggles my mind how you can be fighting with the Germans one day and then all of a sudden align yourself with the Soviets. I mean, it's a massive mind shift. How can you be pro-Nazi one day and then pro-communist the next? I guess, one dictatorship's as good as the other to them, but you had units in the Eastern Front that were from German allied countries just decide, hey, we're going to shoot our officers and then become communists, and they turn themselves around, which is very odd. It's like in Finland, near the end of the war, things were going bad. The Finns knew what was going to happen, and they kicked the Germans out of Finland. The Germans were pretty upset about it because they thought the Finns were their allies, but the Finns were in for their own nationalistic ideas. They wanted to regain the part of the country the Soviets had stolen at the beginning of the war. They got it back, and then the Soviets came in and took it back from them. And in order to keep the Finns from getting punished and having their country occupied by the Soviets, they kicked the Germans out and said, look what we've done. We're no longer pro-German.
Right.
But most of the Finns probably were very pro-German. They just didn't want to get occupied by the Soviets.
Extra, read all about it.
If you're like me, and I'll bet you are, you like to be on the cutting edge of honest news and accurate information. 26 times a year, the American Free Press newspaper can be delivered to your door, packed with the kind of uncensored news that I know you're going to appreciate. If you're ever dissatisfied with your subscription to the American Free Press, their guarantee is that you just drop them an email and they will gladly refund the unused portion of your subscription. So what are you waiting for? Visit www.americanfreepress.net. Once again, www.americanfreepress.net. And find out about the American Free Press. Do it today.
Extra, read all about it.
So what exactly happened in the Battle of Berlin? I mean, just lay it out. Exactly what happened.
By December of 1944, the Battle of Bulge is going on. The Germans had taken a lot of units from the east fighting the Soviets to reinforce their effort at the Battle of the Bulge. By January, the Battle of the Bulge ended, and the German army in the west was depleted. All they could do is barely hang on and defend. They could no longer conduct major operations. But because they had weakened their effort by putting all their eggs in the basket on the Battle of the Bulge, the Soviets attacked in January in what was known as the Vistula-Oder River Offensive. There's two rivers on that side of Germany, Vistula and Oder, that flowed from south and north. And the Soviets decided to take advantage of the weakness of the Germans and go for Berlin. So by January, they were pretty doggone close to Berlin. They were about within 80 miles to the east of Berlin. And all they had to do is make one huge push to get there. So they massed their armies to head for Berlin. Now, they were also fighting all along the other fronts all the way down to the Adriatic Sea. I mean, there are Russians everywhere. But they had mass. They had millions of soldiers, and the Germans were quickly losing all theirs. So the tide kind of turned. It became an attrition warfare type of thing. They were just going to outlast the Germans by throwing mass numbers of Soviets at the Germans. And losses didn't mean a whole lot to the Soviets. And their doctrine, a person is, they're a mechanism for the state. It doesn't matter that they're a human being. Just get out there and kill Germans, and if you get lost, we'll plug somebody in your place because we got more. And that's what they did. So, the Germans were running out of people. They were quickly being just overwhelmed by the numbers. There were probably 750,000 soldiers available to the Germans to defend Berlin. The Soviets had 2.3 million. They grossly outnumbered the Germans. They outnumbered the Germans in terms of artillery 4.5 to 1. They just had tons of stuff. In terms of tanks, probably outnumbered the Germans 5.5 to 1 easily in number of tanks. And we were giving them tanks. By the boatloads, we'd send Sherman tanks to them. And, of course, they were building their T-34s, which is a low-quality tank with high quality characteristics. It was not as well made as the German tanks, but all they needed is quantity, and it was a very good tank. I say low quality, it didn't have a lot of amenities in it, and it was kind of typical Soviet made junk. It's just big and bulky, and it was not a technically high quality machine, but it did exactly what they needed. It just overwhelmed the Germans. And so what they were doing at Berlin is Stalin put two of the major commanders kind of at odds to see who could get there first. He kind of challenged them. And so, they were moving fast. And so the first Belarusian front under Zhukov was literally due east of Berlin. And then Ivan Konyev was the first Ukrainian front commander south of Berlin. And it was kind of a competition to see who could get there first and capture Berlin. It was kind of a point of honor thing. And who cares how many Soviet soldiers get killed? We're just going to drive straight ahead. High diddle diddle right up the middle. And the Germans were still technically or tactically very proficient. And interestingly, before they got to Berlin, they had to cross these rivers, which were major obstacles for the Soviets, but they were very proficient at crossing water obstacles. And so at the place called Salo Heights, which is due east of Berlin, and I'm trying to remember how far it is. I never got a chance to go there because when I lived in Berlin, it was all under Soviet control. You couldn't go there. Salo Heights is probably, I'm thinking, 30 miles east of Berlin. And there was a huge battle where the Russians or the Soviets crossed the river to get to the Germans, and they just got creamed on the Oder River. It was absolutely a slaughter, but the Soviets didn't care. High diddle diddle up the middle. We don't care how many it takes. We'll get them. The Germans did a masterful defense, but it was an active defense. They were pulling back, a mobile defense. They were pulling back, getting ground, but killing Soviets by the truckload. But they could not match the mass the Soviets had, and they got pushed back. That was the last big battle before the battle for Berlin. And so when Salo Heights fell to the Soviets, they eventually got across the river. They suffered huge casualties. They were literally on the doorsteps of Berlin by then because the Germans had nothing else to give up. They had to fight from Berlin.
A lot of the German resistance were actually like kids and women.
There were probably, in terms of ratio, ground troops, the Germans probably had a ratio of 7 to 1 to the, or maybe 8 to 1 to the Volkssturm. But the Volkssturm, remember, is like the militia. They're not highly trained. They give them a rifle or an anti-tank weapon. The favorite thing was giving them a Panzerfaust or some sort of anti-tank weapon, telling them to go out there and kill a tank. But that was suicide. A lot of these young kids went out there, shot the tanks, and then were killed because it's a one-shot weapon. And,
right.
Of course, the tanks had infantry with them.
So you were talking about those Soviet tanks. See, I always thought that the Panzer tanks were like the best tanks that had ever been made. But maybe I'm mistaken about that.
Yeah, the Germans. I'm sorry.
Because you had talked about how good the Soviet tanks were. So then I was always of the opinion that it was the Panzer tanks that were the best tanks that were ever made. But
well, actually, Panzer is the German word for tank. So the Panzers the Germans were making were qualitatively better than the Soviet tanks. The problem is they were so qualitatively better, it took more money and more time to make them. The Soviets were milling these T-34s out by the bucket loads because they were a lower quality machine, but they could make millions of them much quicker, and they were not as technically well made. The stuff on the inside, the Germans had their tanks ergonomically designed. The Soviets didn't care. So what they did is they went out and they recruited battalions of dwarfs because their tanks were very cramped, and they put the dwarfs in the tanks, so you couldn't be over 5 foot. I think their height requirement was 5'6" is the tallest you could be and be a Soviet tanker. So they put little people in because they weren't ergonomically designed. The Germans didn't do that. But that caused a problem. The German tanks were generally higher silhouette. And until they came out with the Panther tank, they really didn't have a tank that could go head-to-head with the T-34. The Tiger could. But the Panthers and Tigers were few and far between. They were grossly outnumbered by the T-34s. The Tiger tanks had a tendency to have a lot of mechanical problems, and the Panthers did too. They weren't completely fielded, but again, they were more complex than the T-34s. So Soviet, T-34, it could be a good tank. The design was incredibly good. The armor was sloped so it wouldn't catch shot. The Panther was a takeoff on that. They sloped the armor on the Panther. And a Panther could go up against T-34, no problem. But they didn't have enough of them.
So the Soviet tanks, were they made in part or in whole with Lend-Lease materials, or were they a complete Soviet enterprise?
They were complete Soviet enterprise. They had started making them at the beginning of the war before we started doing Lend-Lease. They mined their own ore. They took them to their own factories and made their own tanks there. It was a very good design.
Well, as I understand it as well, the Sherman tanks were, pretty much very inferior. But again, like you said, of the Soviet tanks, the Americans could crank out however many thousands of Shermans out of a factory, for every one or two Panzers that the Germans were cranking out. And so it was just a sheer overwhelming number of tanks that was winning that.
Yes, absolutely. There's a good book out. Young guy wrote, Adam Makos, just published his book about a year ago called Spearhead. And he talks about this problem the Americans have with the Sherman tanks. Shermans were high technology in 1941. By 1943, they were way behind, and they were terrible tanks. Amazingly, the Army kept them until the 1950s, but they just upgunned them. They didn't do anything about the motor design, the chassis. It was not a very good tank. It was okay. It wasn't great. The benefit was, and Adam Makos points out in his book Spearhead, that these tanks made in quantity could overwhelm the Germans who went for quality. They just couldn't produce as many tanks. It wasn't until the very, very end of the war that we got a tank that could go head-to-head with the German Tigers and Panthers, and that was the M26 Pershing tank. But they came in way too late. We only had, I think, a company's worth by the end of the war, and they were in the 3rd Armored Division. And that's what the book is based on, how they used these tanks at the very end of the war.
And so were the tanks on the Soviet part, were they a very integral, were they the key to the Battle of Berlin, or do you think that, basically things were so far gone that all the Soviets had to do was show up to take the city?
Well, until they reached the city, the tanks were very important. Once they got to the city, the tanks were not as important because they got bogged down in the streets and got hit with the German anti-tank weapons, which were very, very effective at short range. So the tanks were not as important, but what they did use is they used artillery. They had self-propelled artillery, and they would blow the buildings apart. The ones that were left from the Allied bombing, they would use them in direct fire mode, which is not how you normally use artillery, but you can use it that way. If they drive up at the end of the block and then aim the artillery piece at the building and just demolish the building, and whoever was in it was gone. But they also had to be protected by infantry. Tanks and self-propelled artillery had to be protected by the infantry, and the Russians, or the Soviets, had millions of soldiers involved in this. It was incredible, what they had, and the number of casualties was tremendous.
So you would think that, Berlin's the capital, that everything militarily, Germany would have Berlin would therefore be the center, everything would come out from Berlin. So you would think that whatever was left of the German military capacity would have been in Berlin. and the Soviets would have, had to confront and overcome, whatever the last bit of whatever that Germany had to take Berlin. Was that the case, or was Germany's military assets already scattered and gone, and Berlin was just sitting there waiting to be plucked?
Yeah, that's a good question. The answer is the German military was totally decimated by then. By January 1945, they could not do any kind of major offensive operations. When you talk about the German army, for example, you talk about 3rd Panzer Army, which was north of Berlin. Hitler demanded that 3rd Panzer Army and Army Group Steiner attack to relieve Berlin. He was totally delusional. An army group should have been millions of men and tons of, hundreds of tanks, thousands of tanks. They hardly had a battalion's worth of tanks. They just were not what they were being called. So you can call a German infantry division a division. They may not have more than a battalion's worth of men, 700 men maybe, and they're supposed to have 10,000. That's a normal division. But they were down to 700 men. They were still calling them divisions. That's ridiculous. They were so decimated that Hitler was delusional. He's telling Army Group Steiner, come rescue us. Steiner couldn't do anything. He didn't have more than just a few tanks and a few thousand men. That's it. And he's called an army group. And that's a huge organization in reality, but they never changed the name. They just kept calling them army group, and it really wasn't more than about a brigade-sized unit, which would have been, a couple of thousand men and maybe 25 tanks. That's all he had.
So you had talked about, earlier, the Soviets come through, they're destroying everything in their path. They're raping every woman they can grab a hold of. Just paint us the graphic, gory picture.
Yes. The Soviets had been pretty brutalized by the German army. It wasn't so much the army, although the army did participate in it. It was mainly the SS that came afterwards that policed up all the people that they wanted to execute, anybody that was considered a political enemy. And then they instituted the Commissar order under Hitler's direction, which meant the political commissars in the the Soviet military units had a second in command who was a hardcore communist to make sure every order was followed to the letter. And if they weren't, he had the authority to execute the Soviet commander. So these are bad people. The Germans took these people out of the prisoner of war camps and lined them up and shot them. They said, these are communists, they're hardcore, we're going to execute them. And then, they committed a number of other atrocities against the Russian people, the Soviets, and against, unfortunately, the Ukrainians, who were very pro-German. And they turned the Ukrainians off and actually made them enemies when they shouldn't have been. So now that they're coming towards Germany, the Germans knew of all the bad things that had happened in the Soviet Union. They knew what was going to happen because Ilya Ehrenberg, who was a Soviet propagandist, worked for Stalin, was on the radio exhorting Soviet soldiers to commit war crimes. He's telling them, the German women are yours, take them and do whatever you want. And that's what they did. The Soviets did it.
Welcome to the Christendom curriculum. Every parent who decides to homeschool wants to secure a great education for their child, while also saving time and money. But these days, many parents have another concern. They also want a homeschool curriculum without all the multiculturalist, politically correct diversity doctrine that's really little more than a thin disguise for an anti-Christian, anti-American, and anti-Western civilization bias. Now there is such a curriculum. The Christendom curriculum gives your children a complete education in Bible, history, literature, and more, focusing on the classic academic skills of reading, writing, and arithmetic. But we also tell the story of Christendom, the story of the Christian nations, especially as Christ's kingdom has been historically manifest in the nations of Europe and America. And we do so without apology. The Christendom curriculum is the only Christian nationalist homeschool program you'll find. We support the right of the European and American peoples to their historic Christian cultures against the globalist leftists who want to destroy those cultures. Not only that, but we provide assigned reading courses for various hot-button subjects in our current culture wars, including feminism, social justice, and cultural Marxism, among others. These reading courses will teach your kids how to survive a social justice warrior attack, how to debate with leftists on social media, how to reform their local churches and communities, and more. We're living in a time of tremendous historical and social change. Christians have the opportunity now to begin building the culture and civilization of the next 1,000 years and beyond. It's an exciting time to be alive. So if you want to help raise the next generation of culture warriors, if you want your children to grow up with a love for Christ's kingdom and for their own nation, while at the same time learning how to defend America and rebuild the West, the easy-to-use Christendom curriculum is for you. Click the Learn More button to get in on the action. And thanks for listening.
So when the Germans were, in Russia, when they were, their Eastern campaign and so forth.
Yes.
And I'm not saying that the Germans, might not have brutalized Soviets and they might not have committed war crimes. I guess what I'm getting at is, was the Soviet response an in-kind response, or was it a completely overblown response? In other words, were the Germans wholesale raping the Soviet women when they were, marching through Russia?
I haven't seen the evidence of that, although some did happen. I haven't seen that kind of action. I think it was what they consider to be retaliation, revenge, retribution for unjust behavior by the Germans, but I think they gave it back in spades. It was much worse, I think, especially in Berlin with the number of rapes.
Right. And so then after the war, after the, after the Battle of Berlin, after the Soviets had, I'm not going to use the word liberated the city because they far from liberated anything. But after the Soviets had established, their conquest of Berlin, shall we say, what was life for the German people like after that? Because I'm sure that the aftermath was probably worse than the battle itself.
Oh, yeah. The Germans, literally thousands starved to death because there was no food. The Germans, or the Soviets, were taking everything. Hundreds of thousands fled to the west as refugees into what became West Germany. And then the communist East Germans came in to take control immediately. And then they started doing what communists do. They were doing what the Nazis did. They were eliminating anyone who might have been an opponent. And by 1948, the communists had thoroughly purged East Germany of anyone who they thought was a significant opponent, and they kept doing it. Interestingly enough, they took into the East German military, and the East German army was not started back until 1955. They had what was called the Barrack People's Police, and it's KVP, Kaserne Volkspolizei. That was the German army. It was East German, and they wore Soviet-style uniforms for the first couple of years, and the German people hated them because all it reminded them of is being occupied by Soviets. So when the East Germans formed the new East German army, and they started transitioning over in the late 40s, and then 55 when they formed the East German army, they went to the uniform that almost identical at the distance of what the German army had in World War II. Virtually, it was unchanged. There were minor changes to it, but it looked like a German World War II uniform, and that's what they wore. And the Germans could tolerate that. But what they didn't want is the brown Soviet uniform, which is what the Kaserne Volkspolizei wore. They were hardcore communists.
At the end of the war, I remember, of course, reading that Patton was of the opinion that the Soviets, should have been our enemy.
Yes.
And he was actually allowing the Germans who were in his custody, to drill and to train and to exercise and to maintain, some kind of dignity, of military decorum, and even physical fitness. Just, if for no other reason, thinking that, we may need to, we may need to ally ourselves with these men, or that these men may ally themselves with us, and, sooner or later, maybe everybody will realize who the real enemy is. What was going on that would cause basically the U.S. general who was supposed to be in charge of Germany to take that approach post-war?
Well, Patton really had no army at the end of the war. His Third Army was taken away from him, and he was given 15th Army, which is a name only. There was no 15th Army. It was a historical unit to write the history of the campaigns in Europe. But he was like a military governor in the southern part of Germany, and he saw the Germans in a totally different light. He saw the German military as being a largely honorable opponent. You beat them on the field just like in a boxing match. You beat them in the boxing ring, you shake hands and go away. He saw them as an honorable opponent. He'd beaten on the battlefield. They knew they were defeated. So he saw them totally different than the way the Soviets saw the Germans. He knew that communists were very, very bad. And he saw them as like Nazis. And so what he was angry at is that they were being allowed, even though they were like the Nazis, to get what they were getting from the U.S., take East Germany, and he said, they're going to come this way someday. We need to take care of them. So he was serious about it. He was thinking, who should we get? And he thought, well, the Germans are pretty good soldiers. Why don't we get them on our side? That's kind of the thinking I think he had, which had a lot of merit. I mean, he knew the German army until 1945 was a pretty good army. And then by that end of the war, it had fallen apart. But they were disciplined, good soldiers. They were smart. Germans are hardworking people. He knew the Soviets were out of control, undisciplined, but they had lots of bad communists in the Soviet army. So he kind of looked at the Germans as being an ally in that respect. He liked discipline.
Mm-hmm. Right. And so how did the Soviets, because, obviously, Patton was willing to treat, the defeated enemy with some respect, with some dignity, like you said. On the contrary, how did the Soviets treat those that they had captured and encamped?
Well, within about 3 years, we had released almost all the prisoners we had. The Soviets kept them until the mid-1950s, and a lot of them never got home to Germany because they died in the Soviet gulags. The lucky ones who survived got home in the mid-50s, and it was a booger for them because they were used to rebuild the Soviet cities. They used them as slave labor, which of course goes against the Geneva Convention, but they didn't care. I mean, that's not a consequence of the Soviets. So being taken a prisoner by the Americans was a very good deal. They knew they were going to get 3 square meals a day. They treated very well. I had friends of mine in Germany who had been captured by the Americans. They thank God every day that they hadn't been captured by the Soviets because they said, we don't know if we would have gotten home.
Hello, I'm Tom Strain, Lieutenant Commander-in-Chief of the Sons of Confederate Veterans. The Confederate flag, Confederate symbols, and the reputation of our Confederate ancestors has come under attack. The Sons of Confederate Veterans is actively fending off our detractors, but there is only so much that we can do. We need your help. Contact your local, state, and national elected politicians and tell them that you will not tolerate these attacks on our heritage. You can also visit scv.org, download an application to join us, in our fight to preserve our Southern heritage. Visit scv.org today. If you don't have a Confederate ancestor and you are tired of American history disappearing, you can assist us by becoming a friend of the SCV. Please visit scvheritagedefense.org and make a donation to the Heritage Defense Fund. We hope that you will join us in the fight to defend the Confederate soldiers' good name.
When you were teaching military history at the Army Staff College, what were your takeaway lessons that you wanted your students to get from the Battle of Berlin?
Well, actually, we never taught it there, which is unfortunate. But we did talk about it in one of the electives that I taught, which was on combat in urban terrain. And we talked about the Battle of Berlin in terms of the number of resources that a large city will absorb. It just takes tremendous amount of resources compared to open terrain. So, we told them, if possible, try to avoid fighting in a large city. But if you have to, be prepared. You're going to have to use tremendous amount of resources in order to win in that environment. And we used, the example of both armies lost a lot, but the Soviets have a huge military cemetery in what used to be East Berlin, and it's still there. Under the agreement, when the Soviets left, the Germans had to leave the Soviet War Memorial and Cemetery. It's kind of a stick in the eye to the Germans, but there's a huge mass grave. There's tens of thousands of Soviet soldiers that died during the Battle for Berlin buried in that mass grave.
So, here in the United States, of course, they're tearing down Confederate monuments. They're, digging up Confederate graves and so forth. But yet, obviously, even the Germans, even the Germans have more respect for the dead, I guess you could say, than to dig up this Soviet grave and to tear down this Soviet memorial. So, I guess, I don't know if I'm asking you for a commentary on the difference between the character of German people versus American people. I don't know exactly what question I'm asking here, but obviously the Germans have a little more character or civility or decency, I guess, than even our own people do.
Yeah, they're very respectful of the cemeteries and stuff. The Soviet cemetery is in Treptow, which is a district of Berlin. It's in terms of the Germans having it there, they don't like it, but they made an agreement with the Soviets that it would not be torn down. It still remains there. The communist Germans don't mind going there and having their ceremonies and stuff, but the anti-communists definitely do not like it there. I misspoke a few minutes ago. I went back in my notes. There's only 5,000 Soviets buried in that grave. Others were buried in other graves, around the city. But it is a huge memorial for the Soviet Army. There's a large statue there of a Soviet soldier holding a German civilian, and it's "We're the Liberator" type statue. And of course, that's not how the Germans see them. They see them as conquerors.
But again, you had talked about how the Germans had an agreement to maintain that monument and so forth. There are all kinds of agreements in place in this country, but obviously in this country, agreements and contracts and don't matter. They're not worth the paper that they're printed on.
No. The next generation doesn't care.
Right. And so so again, obviously the Germans must have a little more character or a little more integrity than and do you think that that's wholesale as far as a people, as a nation, that they have more integrity than we do? Or do you think they just have more integrity in the levels of leadership? Or do you think that they're just not burdened with the bureaucracy like we are? Because, for example, I would say President Trump has integrity, but there are 10,000 people in the bureaucracy under him who do not.
Well, I don't know. It's difficult to characterize the culture of the Germans. It's changed so much since the war. The younger generation today, they've been reprogrammed. As part of the denazification program, we just went overboard and killed any kind of nationalism is a bad word in Germany. You can't be proud of your country, and the young Germans are kind of ashamed of their country. It's a shame. Not all of them, but many of them. Their army is a volunteer army now. They used to have universal conscription until just a few years ago, and people don't join the military. They don't see it as honorable. Whereas the Americans study the German military doesn't even study the German military. When I used to do the exchange to the German Army Staff College in Hamburg with our students, I talked to them about this, and they had no interest in it. They're technicians. They don't. It's totally different. It's a very different culture because the generation gap. I lined up a dinner to go eat with a German World War II hero. The guy's name is Hans von Luck. He's passed now, but in 1993, I got it so the students could go see him. I asked my German counterparts, would you like to go to dinner and talk with von Luck? This guy was a big-time German hero, fought under Rommel in North Africa, fought in Normandy, was the guy that his regiment guarded the bridge that the British glider troops were to capture. I mean, the British even invited him to come talk to the British Army students, but the Germans would have nothing to do with him. It's almost like they disavow their history, their military history. And recently, the German Chancellor and Minister of Defense banned a bunch of traditional German Army songs as being fascist. I mean, that's silly. That's like saying Dixie is a racist song. You read the words, there's no racism.
I say, you haven't watched the news lately? I thought Dixie was a racist song.
Yeah. So, they banned all these songs that the Germans have sung for years, had no fascist connections, but like our country, it's a knee-jerk reaction. Oh, it was sung by the Confederates. It must be racist. And they do the same thing. One of their favorite Army songs was called the Panzerlied, the tanker song. It's banned now. It was a very good song, and we used to sing it with our German counterpart units when we trained together. In the movie The Battle of the Bulge that came out in the 1960s, it was made famous because the German soldiers are singing the song, and everybody loved it. And it has nothing about fascism at all. It's just talking about being brave and dying in your tank, attacking the enemy. It's just a great song, but they've done the same thing as they've done with Dixie. They've mislabeled it as a fascist song, like Dixie is now a racist song.
So the German army now, is it pretty much an autonomous army, or is it just basically the military that they're allowed to have?
The German army today is very different from the Bundeswehr I knew back in the 70s and 80s serving in Germany. It's like a social program organization, a Red Cross on steroids. They go to Afghanistan. One of my German army buddies, and I won't mention his name, he's still on active duty, went to Afghanistan, but they're not allowed to go into combat. The German government has given more valor awards to Americans for combat in Afghanistan than they have to German soldiers. But they don't get into combat. They're there to hand out rations and be nice people. It's not the same Germany. No, I'd love to go back to Berlin to see it today. My next door neighbor is German. She escaped from East Berlin as a child back in the late 1950s. Her parents got across from East Germany and came to the West, and she married an American soldier. She lived right across the street. She's writing a book about her experiences as a young East German.
We had a young lady in our church in Florida. I say she was a young lady. She was an older lady. She was in her 80s when I was her pastor, but she had been a young lady, during World War II, and she told me that she could remember being baptized the Sunday that she was baptized in Germany. That there was a British bombing raid. And I can't remember what town she said she grew up in Germany, but she remembered there was a British bombing raid, and she remembers the roof of the church that she was in coming down as she was being baptized.
Wow.
Yeah.
Never too late to be baptized.
Yeah. So did you ever develop a appetite for German food when you were living in Germany?
Oh, yeah, we love German food. Love German food. In fact, our neighbor, I told you that Escape from East Germany invited us over to her house recently, and we had schnitzel. That's one of my favorites, but I'll eat anything German. It's great food.
I was about to say, that's one of the issues that I've had over the years is there just aren't that many German restaurants, and I love the stuff.
Yeah. Well, we have a lot of Germans here in Huntsville, Alabama, because they came here with NASA back in the 50s and 60s, actually 60s when NASA was formed. But the Army brought them here after World War II, so there's a lot of Germans here, and they have several German restaurants, and they're all good.
Right, yeah. I've been told I make a pretty mean crock-pot sauerbraten, so.
Yeah, I gained weight when I was in Germany. I had to lose it when I came back. It was ugly. I had to let my uniform had little let-out tabs on it, the BDU camouflage uniform. Now, my dress uniform was a little different. It was snug. But, I gained – I passed the Brochen shop where they make fresh baked bread every day, and I always stopped and got a bag full of Brochen. Of course, that butter and marmalade, you put on the pounds fast if you don't watch it.
Right. I say German food is very heavy.
Yeah, it's good. I love it.
Yeah. Well, we are going to go ahead and cut the conversation there because we are just about out of time for this week's TBR Radio Presents, the TBR History Hour. But as always, I enjoy these end-of-the-month broadcasts when I get to chat with my good friend, Colonel Edwin Kennedy, who for many years was the professor of military history at the Army Staff College in Leavenworth, Kansas. We'll be talking with Dr. Kennedy again next month, at the last broadcast of the next month, Lord willing, the month of August. And our conversation will be the Korean War. I believe our next couple of broadcasts will be battles and campaigns during the Korean conflict, the Korean War. And so I'll look forward to that conversation. Until then, I'd like to encourage you to go to our website, www.barnesreview.org, www.barnesreview.org. And you can learn about the Barnes Review. You can learn how to become a subscriber to the Barnes Review. You can learn more about TBR Radio and the different programs that we offer there as well. While you're at barnesreview.org and you're in the radio page there, you'll want to look at our other show, TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Show. My guest once again will be Colonel Ed Kennedy, and we will be talking about kind of how the military is misfunctioning right now. For example, an order has just been issued banning the Confederate flag and Confederate symbols and Confederate base names and Confederate monuments and so forth throughout the U.S. military. And the president, the commander-in-chief, has said, keep the Confederate flags, keep the Confederate names. And so the Secretary of Defense and some of the top generals have thought that they could be clever and they could basically make an end run around the commander-in-chief, and that they could ban these things without naming them by name. They're still in direct violation of a direct order of the commander-in-chief. They've still committed court-martialable offenses. They think they're being clever. The truth is, and I talked to Colonel Kennedy about this in that other broadcast, how Bill Clinton was a draft dodger. And if the military leadership had a problem following the orders of a draft dodger, and they probably did at certain points, they never made that publicly apparent or publicly known. The military leadership that we have now is in open defiance of the commander-in-chief. And so there has definitely been a change of culture and function in the United States military. And we talk about that on our other show, TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Show. So I'd like to encourage you to listen to that when you get a chance. If you're listening by YouTube, please click like and subscribe, as both of those things will help our channel and help us get the word out to that many more people. Anyways, we are out of time. So from all of us here at TBR Radio presents the TBR History Hour, God bless.